In fairness, I was very clear right at the outset. I do not condone it from a moral perspective. Morally, I definitely disagree with the blood doctrine of the witnesses, and they exert a lot of undue authority. But the moment this becomes a matter of law, secular societies have towed a pretty understandable, defensible position on this, even though it tips in the favor of witnesses. Oh, okay, this is interesting. Okay, so I got this question privately a couple of months ago. Dear Derek, I watched your video on the JW's blood doctrine. How can you defend that, man? Not cool. I respect where you're coming from. In fairness, I was very clear right at the outset. I do not condone it from a moral perspective. I agree with the consistency of the legislation. That's you can say that that's endorsing it. I don't endorse any kind of coercion about things that involve decisional autonomy. I think that how the Supreme Court has decided these in Western democratic lands is very consistent. And it actually, I think it's one of the few reasons why we don't have a mandatory vaccine yet. Now, these questions of the blood doctrine will probably be revisited and reinvigorated in the aftermath of COVID-19, because we're kind of finding that, there is a public imperative the public does have a say on what you do with your body to some extent. If you don't take the vaccine, this is going to happen. You're going to, infections will increase, and that's going to take that's going to cost public health care. And so it involves, whether you agree with this COVID thing or not, it involves that argument. And so I think following the pandemic, if they do make mandatory vaccines, certainly for certain industries, or straight across the board, I think that it's going to reinvigorate some of these questions about medical decisional autonomy. But I agree, as it's presently standing, I agree with how the courts have largely decided this. That the state does not have a right to say that you need this sort of treatment or not. And there's also, I know I'm repeating everything I said in that video, but there is discussion, while there is something of a consensus that blood transfusions are necessary and all this, it's not just a witness position. There are objections to blood transfusions, and there's a lot of support, by the way, for bloodless alternatives, independent of the religious side of this argument. There are secularist doctors that, on a scientific basis, disagree with other doctors on this. So I feel a tremendous amount of sympathy for those who were socially coerced into this. I interviewed Michelle Hoffman, and God, it just broke my heart, that her husband, who passed away, he had to take blood transfusions. He was an elder for a time, and then he got very ill, and he was starting to question his faith. Both of them were at the time, and he privately took some blood transfusions towards the end of his life. And she said, I wouldn't have gotten those extra months of life out of him. I mean, the medical community definitely confirmed that. And it's like, well, yeah, obviously my heart goes out to her incredibly. I don't endorse what the witnesses do, how they use the disfellowshipping, the threat of excommunication to manipulate into these medical decisions. That's almost as egregious as the state themselves interfering. But now you see how it becomes not just a situation of medical autonomy, but if the religion is saying you can't have a blood transfusion, how this becomes a religious membership decision now from the standpoint of secular authorities, right? And in the States, they'll be seen as endorsing a religion, breaking the Establishment Clause of the Constitution by weighing into that, because it necessarily involves questions of religious membership, not just medical matters. One more thing I want to say about the blood issue here. The question becomes very complicated when it involves children. That is often when the media blows these stories up, you'll notice. A 25-year-old who decides not to get a blood transfusion, that's not really going to make the news. Not really, unless there's some extenuating circumstance. He's a witness who had a caretaker or something like that. He didn't have all of his faculties, something like that. But now this is where it's still not the child or the parents who have a la carte in this. There is, in most Western democratic lands, there is something approximating a best interest test and a mature minors test. And you're going to see people land, judges are going to say, okay, the state does actually have to get involved here. The state trumps the parental authority in this case, based on the medical evidence and based on the maturity of all the parties involved. Other times, the judge will swing the other way, depending on how the child or the mature minor comports himself. So I'm not... morally, I definitely disagree with the blood doctrine of the witnesses, and they exert a lot of undue authority. But the moment this becomes a matter of law, I think that secular societies have towed a pretty understandable, defensible position on this, even though it tips in the favor of witnesses. So you can say I was endorsing them. You can say, how can you defend that man? I understand where you're coming from. I don't endorse it morally. I just think that it's a consistent legal position. Hey good people, did you like this video? Well, do yourself a favor and subscribe already. Also, if you love books and want to talk about things sort of unrelated to the Jehovah's Witnesses, be sure to subscribe to my other channel called the Derek London Podcast. Click this little button right here to do that, alright? And I'll see you over there. I'm out. Peace.